Dutch Schultz declared war on Harlem, and nobody in that city slept the same night. Bumpy Johnson locked his jaw, stared at the map of streets he had bled for, and felt one thing: rage. Cut back to when the line hadn't been drawn yet, and Harlem still didn't know what was coming. Sama, etusine, oni hundred, afemoktrediu. Harlem breathed differently than the rest of New York. You could feel it the moment you stepped off the subway at 125th Street. The heat pressed down like a hand on your chest, thick with the smell of frying fish, cigarette smoke, and something older. Something that had been baking into the concrete for decades. This was not Manhattan's polished avenues or Brooklyn's working docks. This was Harlem, and Harlem had its own clock. By 7 in the morning, the numbers runners were already moving. Young men with quick feet and quieter mouths, slipping folded slips of paper through mail slots, collecting pennies and nickels from women who worked double shifts at white people's houses uptown. The numbers game was Harlem's heartbeat, informal, invisible, and worth more than any bank on Fifth Avenue would admit. Nobody talked about it loudly. Nobody needed to. Everyone understood. Bumpy Johnson understood better than most. He sat at his usual table at the back of a small restaurant on Lenox Avenue every morning at 9. Same chair, same cup of black coffee, same copy of the Amsterdam News folded once across his knee. He never arrived first and never arrived last. Timing was control. And control was everything Bumpy Johnson had built his life around. He was not a large man. That surprised people who expected something different. Someone louder, bigger, more obviously dangerous. What they got instead was a small, quiet presence, with eyes that moved constantly and a jaw that rarely unclenched. He dressed well. He spoke precisely. And in the 2 years since, he had taken firm control of Harlem's illegal businesses. Not a single dollar had moved through these streets without his knowledge. That was the system. And the system worked. The numbers operation alone brought in somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000 a week during the busy summer months, when workers had a little extra and hope was cheaper than rent. Bumpy took his cut carefully, paid his people on time, and kept the police at just the right distance, close enough to be useful, far enough to avoid owing them favors. He had relationships with 3 police captains, 2 city council members, and 1 federal agent who preferred cash to questions. None of it was accidental. Every connection had been built slowly, tested quietly, and kept up at a precise cost. Then Dutch Schultz opened his mouth. The news came through ways that didn't use phones. A word passed at a barber shop on 7th Avenue, a nod exchanged outside a jazz club on 133rd Street. Dutch Schultz, the Bronx beer boss turned gambling racket boss, had decided that Harlem's numbers operation was too profitable to leave in black hands. He had said this plainly, without apology, to men who reported back within 24 hours. He was moving in. No negotiation, no offer to be partners, just a statement of what he intended, delivered like a property notice. Bumpy set down his coffee cup. He did not slam it. He did not raise his voice. He placed it down with a steadiness that made the man sitting across from him, a runner named Calvin, who had delivered the news, visibly exhale with relief. Because Calvin had expected something explosive, what he got instead was stillness. And somehow, that was worse. How many people heard him say it? Bumpy asked. Room of maybe 12, Calvin said. His people. But word travels. Word always travels, Bumpy said. That's not the problem. He spent the next 3 days doing something that confused everyone around him. Nothing visible. No meetings called. No warnings sent out. No muscle sent to corners or collection points. From the outside, Harlem's operation looked exactly as it always had. Runners moving, money collecting, business turning over with quiet efficiency. But underneath, Bumpy was working 3 moves at once. First, he steadied the community layer. He made personal appearances at 4 churches that week, donated to 2 neighborhood funds, and personally visited 6 of his most senior collectors to confirm their loyalty, not with threats, but with specifics. He reminded each one exactly how much they made under his system, how their families benefited, and what chaos looked like when outside money came in and burned local systems to the ground. He had seen it happen in other neighborhoods. He described it in detail. Second, he locked the information channels. Any rumor about Schultz's plans moving through Harlem's street network got quietly redirected. He had people at barbershops, at church events, at the numbers drops themselves. The story he allowed to spread was simple. Nothing has changed. Business continues. Schultz is just noise. Third, he began tracking cash movement with a care that was almost obsessive. Every unusual transaction, every new face buying into the numbers, every runner who seemed distracted or nervous, all of it was passed back to Bumpy through a chain of trusted go-betweens. He was building a map, not of streets, but of weak points. No territory truly belongs to anyone. It only belongs to whoever has tested it hardest most recently. Then came the Tuesday that changed the temperature. A collector named Roosevelt Williams, 41 years old, who had worked Harlem's East Side for 6 years without a single problem, was found on the pavement outside a hardware store on 116th Street at 2:30 in the afternoon. Both hands broken, jaw fractured in 2 places. The money he had been carrying was gone. 3 witnesses saw 2 white men in a black car drive away slowly, making no attempt at speed. They wanted to be seen. Harlem understood the message immediately. It was not random. It was a demonstration. Schultz was not testing the operation's money or its setup. He was testing its nerve. He was asking one question with Roosevelt Williams's broken body. What will Bumpy Johnson do when someone touches what's his in broad daylight? Bumpy visited Roosevelt in the hospital that evening. He sat beside the bed for 20 minutes without speaking. He paid every medical bill in cash before he left. He told Roosevelt's wife that her husband's salary would continue while he recovered, and that her children's school costs would be covered through the end of the year. Then he walked back out into the Harlem night, got into his car, and sat in silence for a long time. The knock had come unannounced, exactly as those kinds of knocks always do. Money has a smell. Not the clean, abstract smell people imagine when they think about wealth. Not leather and cologne and polished wood. Real street money smells like sweat and paper, and the particular anxiety of someone who needs it badly enough to do something they'll regret. Bumpy Johnson had been smelling that particular combination for years. He could identify it across a room. By the second week after Roosevelt Williams's beating, the smell had changed in Harlem. It started with the younger runners' boys, 19, 20, 22 years old kids who had grown up watching Bumpy's operation run like clockwork, who had earned their positions through a mix of reliability and neighborhood reputation. They began to hesitate in small ways. A collection that usually took 40 minutes stretched to 90. A drop-off that should have happened at noon got pushed to 3. Nothing dramatic enough to call out directly, just friction, where there had been none before. Bumpy noticed within 48 hours. He said nothing publicly. Instead, he began a quiet check, not of the money, but of the timing. He tracked every transaction in his network against its expected schedule and mapped the delays. What he found was a pattern that was almost elegant in its simplicity. The delays clustered around 6 specific street corners in a rough diagonal line running from 110th Street up to 140th. Someone was working a corridor moving through Harlem's operation, not like a battering ram, but like water finding the cracks, applying gentle pressure, letting the structure absorb it before applying more. Dutch Schultz was not stupid. That was the problem. The money entering Harlem through these channels was not in large amounts, nothing that would set off alarms. $5 here, $10 there, promises of 20% cuts on future earnings. The kind of offers that a 19-year-old who sends half his paycheck home to his mother finds genuinely difficult to refuse. Schultz's people understood that you don't flip an entire operation by threatening it. You flip it one tired, underpaid young man at a time. And the police were not helping. 3 of Bumpy's police relationships had gone suddenly quiet, not hostile, not clearly pulled away, just unavailable. Phone calls that used to be returned within an hour now sat unanswered for days. One captain, who had been reliable for 18 months, suddenly had a scheduling conflict every time a meeting was requested. Bumpy knew what that meant. Someone had put a second envelope on the table, a heavier one. He could have hunted the people who switched sides. There were men in his organization who would have handled that job efficiently and without needing to be asked twice. A name whispered in the right ear, a conversation that ended badly for someone, and the message would have been delivered clearly enough. He chose differently. Instead of chasing betrayal, Bumpy began feeding it. He identified the 6 runners who were wavering and did something that seemed almost strange on its surface. He promoted 3 of them. Small promotions, better routes, slightly higher cuts, minor titles that meant nothing structurally but felt important to a 20-year-old trying to establish himself. He gave them visibility inside the organization. And then, carefully, he began routing specific financial information through them, not false information, real numbers, real routes, real timing, but selected with precision. He was marking the money flow the way a hunter marks a trail. Money doesn't build loyalty. It just buys quiet, and quiet has an expiration date. Within 11 days, the information he had planted began showing up in decisions made by Schultz's people on the street. A collection point got hit at exactly the wrong moment. A runner was caught on a route that had just been quietly changed, except in the version of events that had passed through Bumpy's marked channels. The deviations were too specific to be coincidence. He now knew which 3 runners had switched sides. He knew the route the information was traveling, and he knew roughly how far up Schultz's structure the pipeline reached. What he had not expected was what the money trail showed him next. He had assumed the flow stopped at Schultz. It did not. Following the financial threads backward through the network of go-betweens, the men who moved cash without knowing where it came from, the lawyers who processed it without asking questions, the businessmen who accepted it as investment money. Bumpy traced the money to sources that had nothing to do with Dutch Schultz's Bronx operation. There were names connected to city government, names connected to real estate, names that appeared on charity foundation boards and Chamber of Commerce membership lists, white names, mostly established names, names that would never appear in a newspaper story about Harlem's numbers war, because those names existed in an entirely different world, one where violence was other people's problem, and money simply appeared through the right channels. Bumpy sat with that information for 2 days before he told anyone. The meaning was significant. If Schultz's move into Harlem was being financially supported even indirectly by people with that kind of powerful reach, then this was not simply a fight over territory between 2 criminal organizations. It was something with deeper roots, something that had been planned more carefully than a street-level takeover usually was. He needed to understand who else was watching. He got his answer sooner than he expected, from a direction he had not anticipated. A message arrived through a channel that Bumpy recognized immediately as belonging not to Schultz's people, not to the police, and not to anyone operating at street level. The message was brief. It requested a meeting. It named a time and a location. It was signed indirectly but clearly, with the authority of Lucky Luciano. Bumpy read the message twice, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket, and finished his coffee. The money trail had led somewhere much larger than Dutch Schultz. And now the largest structure in organized crime on the East Coast wanted to sit down and talk. Lucky Luciano did not meet people in restaurants. He met them in places that were already his rooms, where the furniture, the staff, the exits, and the silence all belonged to him before the conversation began. The location he chose for Bumpy Johnson was a private club in Midtown Manhattan, 3 floors above a legitimate import business, accessible through a service entrance on a side street that most people walked past without noticing. Bumpy arrived 7 minutes early. He noted 2 men near the entrance who were not hiding the fact that they were security. He noted the staircase setup, 1 way up, 1 possible exit through a kitchen. He noted that he had been offered no weapons check, which meant either they trusted him completely or they had already decided the meeting would end peacefully regardless of what he carried. He filed all of it and walked through the door. The room was smaller than he expected. A round table, 4 chairs, 2 men already seated Luciano at the far end, and beside him a younger associate whose name Bumpy knew but whose face he was seeing for the first time. There was food on the table that nobody had touched, a bottle of wine that had been opened but not poured, the setup of a meal without the pretense of appetite. Luciano looked older than his photograph suggested. His face carried the specific kind of tiredness that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from years of sustained calculation. His eyes, though, were precise. They moved to Bumpy once, and then stayed there. Not aggressive, not warm. Simply focused in the way that a man is focused when he is deciding something important. "Sit down," Luciano said. It was not an invitation. Bumpy sat. "You've been running Harlem clean for 2 years," Luciano said. "Numbers operation. No significant violence, no heat from the federal level. You pay who needs to be paid, and you keep the product moving." He paused. "That's harder than it sounds." "I know how hard it is," Bumpy said. Luciano almost smiled. "Dutch thinks he can do it better." "Dutch thinks a lot of things." The room was quiet for a moment. Somewhere below them, street noise filtered up through the walls. A car horn, distant voices, the ordinary sound of a city that had no idea this conversation was happening. "Here's what I want you to understand," Luciano said. "I'm not here because I care about Harlem. I'm here because I care about structure. Dutch, moving into your territory without permission, creates a problem that goes beyond the two of you. It sets an example. Other people start looking at other neighborhoods and thinking the same thing." He leaned forward slightly. "That costs me money, which means it costs everyone money." "Then stop him," Bumpy said. "It's not that simple." "It seems simple to me." Luciano looked at him steadily. "What you brought here tonight, the numbers walk me through them." Bumpy had prepared for this. He did not pull out papers or notes. He recited from memory weekly gross earnings, operating costs, police overhead, percentage return to neighborhood needs, net profit margin across 12 months. He spoke for 4 minutes without stopping, without hesitation, without a single number that contradicted what Luciano's own people had independently confirmed before this meeting was set up. When he finished, the room was quiet again. "Schultz's operation in the Bronx runs at roughly 60% of that efficiency," Luciano's associate said. It was the first time he had spoken. "I know," Bumpy said. "Dutch doesn't understand what makes your numbers work," Luciano said. "He thinks it's location." "It's not location." "No," Bumpy agreed. "It's relationships." Luciano nodded slowly, "Which is exactly why I haven't stopped him yet." The word "yet" landed in the room with weight. "I need to know something first," Luciano continued. "I need to know whether you can maintain that operation under pressure. Whether the structure holds when someone is actively trying to break it, because if I step in now, before that question is answered, I'm making a decision based on 2 years of comfortable performance. That's not the same as knowing what you're worth when things get difficult." Bumpy understood what was being said. He was being tested not by Dutch Schultz's street-level aggression, but by Luciano's deliberate decision to allow that aggression to continue long enough to generate information. Harlem was a testing ground. Bumpy Johnson was the experiment. In any power structure, the most dangerous seat is the one nobody offered you. He felt something cold move through him. Not fear, something more precise than fear. The particular clarity that comes when you understand exactly what kind of situation you're actually in, as opposed to the one you thought you were in. "You're going to let him keep pushing," Bumpy said. "It was not a question." "For now," Luciano said. "And if you can't hold it, then Dutch takes Harlem, and we have a different conversation about different terms." Luciano poured wine into one glass, his own, and did not offer the bottle. "But if you hold it, then we have this conversation. Harlem stays yours under the structure. With the Commission's recognition, you operate with protection you don't currently have, and Dutch becomes someone else's problem." Bumpy looked at the untouched food on the table. Someone had prepared it carefully, arranged it with attention to presentation, and none of it would be eaten tonight. "How long?" he asked. "As long as it takes to know the answer," Luciano said. Bumpy stood. He did not extend his hand, and neither did Luciano, not from hostility, but from the shared understanding that nothing had been agreed to yet. An agreement required both parties to have made a choice. Tonight, only one choice had been made, and it had not been Bumpy's. He walked back through the service entrance, down the side street, and into the ordinary noise of Midtown Manhattan. He found his car, got in, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Lucky Luciano was not going to help him. Not yet. Possibly. Not at all. Depending on what happened next. Dutch Schultz was still coming. And now Bumpy Johnson knew that the most dangerous man in his situation was not the one making threats from the Bronx. It was the one who had just poured himself a glass of wine and settled in to watch the outcome with the calm patience of a man who had already decided he would benefit regardless of who won. He started the engine, pulled into traffic, and headed back uptown toward Harlem. There was work to do, and no one was going to do it but him. The rumor hit Harlem on a Wednesday and spread like grease on a hot pan. Bumpy Johnson was losing control. 2 senior collectors had vanished. A police captain sent back a cash envelope unopened. A numbers drop on 128th Street had gone dark for 3 straight days. People whispered it at barber shops, at church steps, at the counters of corner stores, where nobody bought anything but information. By Friday morning, Dutch Schultz had heard every word. Bumpy had written every word himself. He built the rumor, Over 4 days, using 3 separate sources, men who didn't know each other, feeding slightly different versions of the same story into different corners of Harlem. Different streets, different names. Same core message. Bumpy is cracking. Now is the time. It was the most dangerous thing he had ever done. Not because it was complicated, because it required him to let Harlem believe, even for 72 hours, that he was weak. And in a world where reputation was the only currency that couldn't be faked, letting that belief breathe even briefly was a risk with no guaranteed return. But he needed Schultz to stop testing slowly and start moving full commitment. Real money, real men on real corners, visible enough to track, exposed enough to map completely. So Bumpy sat at his table on Lenox Avenue, drank his black coffee, and let the rumor run. His lieutenant Marcus sat across from him Thursday evening. Marcus was not a man who showed fear easily, but his jaw was tight and his hands were flat on the table, which meant he was holding something larger underneath. "You're letting the whole street think we're done," Marcus said. "I'm letting Schultz think we're done," Bumpy said. "That's a different thing. The street can't tell the difference. The street doesn't need to. Not yet." Marcus looked at him hard. "And if it goes sideways?" "Then it goes sideways," Bumpy said, "and we deal with it from the floor." It did not go sideways. Within 72 hours, Schultz pushed $40,000 into Harlem. Not the slow, careful move of the previous weeks. This was loud and fast and almost reckless. New faces appeared on corners that had been Bumpy's for years. 2 collection points got physically taken over by Schultz's men, who stood there in plain sight like they were planting a flag. A warehouse on the east side got broken into and stripped furniture, equipment, crates. Schultz's people thought it was an operations center. It had been emptied 3 days before they arrived. Every piece of intelligence Schultz was acting on had been carefully fed to him. The collection points his men took were secondary locations already rotated out. The warehouse was shut down. The captain who returned the envelope had done it on Bumpy's direct instruction. Schultz was spending real money, real manpower, and real credibility chasing shadows, moving faster than any man should when he doesn't know the ground has already shifted beneath him. The turning point came on a Saturday afternoon when Marcus laid the full accounting on the table. Not just the money Schultz had burned the internal damage. Schultz had moved without full approval from the men around him. He had pulled organizational funds for what was starting to look less like strategy and more like obsession. 2 of his own lieutenants had raised objections that got steamrolled. A third had gone quiet in a way that meant he was already mentally heading for the exit. Marcus tapped the paper. "He thinks he's winning." "He does," Bumpy said. "He has no idea." "No," Bumpy said. "He doesn't." The trap closed, quietly, on a Monday. Runners returned to their roots. Collection points came back online. The captain accepted a new envelope larger than before, a message of stability, and made himself available again. From the outside, Harlem looked like it had survived a genuine internal crisis. From where Bumpy sat, there had never been a crisis, only a controlled burn that had pulled Schultz forward faster and further than he could afford. Schultz was now overextended, operating on bad intelligence, and carrying the specific recklessness of a man who believed he was 3 steps from finishing something. That state of mind, that hot, narrowing certainty of a man almost at his destination, was the most dangerous condition possible. It made a man capable of decisions that no one around him could walk back. Bumpy would find out exactly what kind of decision that was within 72 hours. He sat in his car outside the restaurant that Monday night. The street smelled like rain and exhaust and fried food from somewhere down the block. Music came through a window 2 floors up, something slow and low. A trumpet, doing something sad, with a melody he almost recognized. He sat there for a long time. Then he drove back toward Lenox Avenue and thought about what came next. Nobody ever wrote the rules down. There was no document, no signed agreement, no meeting where someone stood up and said, "Here is what we do not do." The rules existed the way a knife edge exists. You only fully understood them when you crossed one. Dutch Schultz crossed one in late September 1935, in a room with 8 people, and no discretion whatsoever. He said he was going to kill Thomas Dewey, not in a figure of speech, not as frustration vented between trusted men. He said it as a plan, as a decision already made, as a problem being moved toward a solution. Dewey, Manhattan's special prosecutor, the man who had been building organized crime cases with the patient, suffocating thoroughness of someone who intended to win, had become Schultz's most urgent legal problem. Schultz's answer was to remove Dewey from the picture entirely. He said this out loud in front of 8 people. 4 of them reported it before the week ended. Bumpy heard it through 2 separate channels within 12 hours. That meant it wasn't a rumor. Rumors traveled through one channel and arrived distorted. This arrived clean and identical from 2 different directions. He sat with it in his car outside a diner on 131st Street. Engine off, windows slowly fogging. The street outside was wet. A streetlight reflected off the pavement in a long yellow smear. Somewhere nearby, a dog was barking at something that wasn't going away. He understood immediately what Schultz had done, not just legally, but in terms of structure. Killing a prosecutor at Dewey's level wasn't a crime in the way that word usually applied to the world Bumpy moved through. It was a catastrophic failure of judgment. The kind of move that would bring federal attention down onto every operation in New York, with a weight that made current law enforcement look like a light rain before a hurricane. Schultz wasn't proposing to solve his problem. He was proposing to create everyone else's problem at the same time while solving nothing. The commission met within days. Bumpy wasn't in that room. Harlem didn't have a seat at that table. Not yet, but he had people close enough to the edges to give him a reliable account. The meeting was brief. There was no real debate. The men in that room had not built what they built by letting personal feelings get in the way of clear thinking. They looked at what Schultz was proposing and measured it against what it would cost every operation in New York. The math was not complicated. Schultz had stopped being an asset managing a problem. He had become the problem wearing an asset's face, Marcus told Bumpy the following evening. His voice carried nothing extra. No drama, no satisfaction. Just information moving from one point to another. They voted, Marcus said. I know, Bumpy said. You knew before I said it. I knew when Schultz said it out loud in a room of 8 people that he had already made the decision for everyone else. They were standing outside on Lenox Avenue. The air smelled like cigarette smoke. In October, something cold was moving in. Underneath the city, smelled something that had come down from somewhere colder and was staying. A bus went past and the smell of diesel rolled through and then dissolved. What does this mean for us? Marcus asked. Bumpy was quiet for a moment, because the answer required honesty that was not entirely comfortable. Harlem stays ours, he said, but we step fully into the structure. Luciano's recognition comes with terms. The independence we've been operating with gets narrower from here. So we win, Marcus said. We win this specific thing, Bumpy said, which is not the same as winning. A system can absorb violence for years. What it cannot absorb is a man who can no longer be predicted. That was the line, not the violence itself. Violence was always present, at every level of everything they all did. The line was control the clear inability to manage decisions under pressure. The proof that a man would act from personal desperation rather than organizational logic. Unpredictable men don't get managed. They get resolved. Bumpy spent the following 2 weeks moving Harlem's operation into a shape that would read to anyone watching from above as stable and reliable and worthy of formal protection. He closed out the runner situations. He met twice with Luciano's representative and presented the same story both times through clean numbers. Harlem produces, Harlem holds. Harlem is worth backing. The representative received this without expression and left without commitment both times. Bumpy understood this as confirmation. The commission didn't signal its decisions early. It acted, and the acting was the signal. He told Marcus to prepare for a structural change, not loud, not visible from the street, but real. The change came faster than expected, from a direction no one was watching. On the evening of October 23rd, Dutch Schultz went to dinner in Newark, New Jersey. He believed, as far as anyone could determine later, that he still had allies, that the situation was still his to manage, that the power he had built over months still meant something in rooms where his name was spoken. He was wrong about every single part of that. The Palace Chop House smelled like old grease, cigarette smoke, and the particular sourness of a room where men had been drinking since before dinner. Dark wood on the walls, stained white tablecloths. Lighting kept low enough that nobody had to look too closely at anything. The kind of place built for men who needed to eat without being remembered. Dutch Schultz walked in at 10 o'clock on the night of October 23rd, 1935. He came with 3 men, Abe Landau, Lulu Rosenkrantz, and his accountant, Otto Berman, a small, quiet man who had spent years keeping Schultz's financial machinery from destroying itself and had received almost nothing in return except continued employment. They took a table near the back. Schultz ordered food. He had been drinking earlier, which was not unusual, and had the loose, warm confidence of a man who had talked himself into believing the worst was behind him. He was wrong, but he had 40 minutes left before that became undeniable. At 10:19, 2 men came through the front door. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't hesitate. One moved toward the bar. The other moved directly toward the table. What happened in the next 90 seconds was so fast and so mechanical that witnesses would spend weeks afterward trying to reconstruct the exact sequence and never fully agree. The gunshots were not loud the way people expect gunshots to be loud. In a small room with low ceilings, they were flat and hard, more like something breaking than something exploding. Landau went down immediately. Rosenkrantz took multiple shots and stayed on his feet, which said something about the man that the circumstances did not allow anyone to appreciate. Berman collapsed at the table, his careful hands still wrapped around a fork. Schultz was in the bathroom when the shooting started. He walked out into the middle of it and caught a single bullet in the stomach. He stayed upright long enough to reach a chair and sit down. He was conscious when the ambulance arrived, conscious during transport, conscious enough at Newark City Hospital to be questioned by detectives who got nothing useful in return. He died the following evening at 8:40 October 24th, 1935, 33 years old. His final hours were a rush of disconnected words that nurses and investigators leaned close to hear and walked away, unable to decode. He revealed nothing. He clarified nothing. He died the way men in his position almost always died, not with understanding, but with the confusion of someone who had not seen the door close until he was already on the other side of it. Harlem heard about it on the radio the next morning. Bumpy Johnson was at his table on Lenox Avenue. Same chair, same black coffee. The radio behind the counter delivered the news in the flat language of a morning broadcast. Dutch Schultz, organized crime figure, dead of gunshot wounds. Newark restaurant, investigation ongoing, no arrests. The cook kept cooking. The woman behind the counter kept wiping a surface that was already clean. 2 men by the window exchanged a look and said nothing. Bumpy set down his cup, picked up his newspaper, read a paragraph he had already read. He stayed another 40 minutes, paid, buttoned his jacket, and walked out onto Lenox Avenue into a morning that looked like every other Harlem morning. Same noise, same movement, same smell of exhaust and coffee and the cold that had settled in overnight and wasn't leaving. But something in the air was different. Not lighter, not warmer, just different, in the specific way of a morning after a long pressure stops. Marcus was waiting on the sidewalk. "It's done," Marcus said. "It's done," Bumpy said. They walked half a block without talking. A delivery truck rumbled past, close enough to feel. A woman moved by with 2 children and a bag of groceries, not looking at either of them. "Was it us?" Marcus asked. "No," Bumpy said. "Luciano, the commission," which is a different answer. Marcus nodded. He understood. Schultz had not been removed because someone decided to remove him. He had been removed because he had made himself impossible to keep. And systems do not warn you before they let you go. They kept walking. The street kept moving. Harlem kept breathing the way it always breathed, loud and layered and indifferent to whatever had just ended. Bumpy stopped at the corner of 125th Street, stood looking up the avenue for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward Lenox Avenue. There were people to see, numbers to check, a structure to steady under new conditions and new obligations. Harlem was still his for now, under terms still being written. That was enough. The radio announcement lasted 43 seconds. Newark restaurant, 4 men shot. Dutch Schultz, dead at 33. Investigation ongoing. No arrests. The announcer moved to the next story without pause. A city council vote, a weather report, something about a bridge on the west side that needed repair. Harlem heard it and said nothing. Not because people didn't care, because they had learned across decades of watching powerful men rise and fall and drag ordinary people down with them, that the correct response was silence until the full shape of what had changed became visible. No church bells, no drinks poured in the street. The numbers runners showed up at their corners the next morning at the same time they always showed up, moving with the same practiced invisibility, collecting the same folded slips from the same tired hands. Nothing looked different. Everything was different. Bumpy Johnson spent the 3 days after Schultz's death doing something that surprised even Marcus. He visited people, not lieutenants, not collectors, not the police captains who would need managing as the new structure settled into place. He visited ordinary people. A woman on 119th Street whose son had been a runner and stopped coming home 6 weeks earlier. An old man on Lenox whose barber shop had been the first place Schultz's money tried to buy a foothold. A church deacon on 133rd who had kept his mouth shut about things he had witnessed and asked for nothing in return. Some of them got cash. Others got nothing except his presence and a conversation that ran longer than it needed to. The woman on 119th didn't look at the money when he put it on her kitchen table. She looked at him. Her eyes were dry and very steady, and they said something that her mouth didn't, that she understood exactly what world her son had been moving through, and that she held no false ideas about who bore responsibility for it, and that she was going to take the money because her rent was due, and she was not in a position to make a stand on principle. Bumpy sat at her table for 20 minutes, drank the coffee she offered, and left without making promises he couldn't keep. Marcus asked him about it on the third evening. They were standing outside on Lenox Avenue, the air sharp with cold and exhaust, and the smell of someone's dinner burning 2 floors above them. "You're not a politician," Marcus said. "No," Bumpy said. "But I'm still standing, and the people who see me standing need to know I remember what it cost. Luciano's people want a meeting. You've been putting it off." "I've been doing what needed doing first," Bumpy said. "Luciano waited 30 years to build what he built. He can wait 3 days for me." He said it flat. No drama. But Marcus heard the weight underneath it and didn't push further. The meeting with Luciano's representative happened on the 4th day. A midtown office above an accounting firm. The room smelled like heating oil and old paper, and the faint, sharp smell of a space cleaned thoroughly and used rarely. A man named Vincent sat across from Bumpy with a single sheet of paper between them and the careful stillness of someone who understood that imprecise words created expensive problems. "The commission recognizes your operation," Vincent said. "Harlem is yours. Numbers, collections, existing setup confirmed under your management." Bumpy looked at the paper without touching it. "And the terms? Standard structure reporting percentage. Coordination on anything crossing borough lines. Close to what I've been doing," Bumpy said. "Is different from exactly what I'll be doing. The difference," Vincent said, "is the paperwork. The practice stays mostly the same." Bumpy picked up the paper, read every line, set it down. The terms were not punishing. They were designed to bring what had been independent into the larger structure without destroying what made it valuable. Luciano understood that Harlem's worth came from Bumpy's specific management of it. Crushing that management would simply destroy the asset, but a long leash was still a leash. Bumpy signed. He drove back to Harlem in the late afternoon, parked on Lenox Avenue, and sat in the car, watching the street move through its evening rhythm. The shift-change crowd pushing out of subway exits, the smell of frying chicken drifting from an open window, a group of teenage boys cutting across the street with the careless speed of people who believed the city would make room for them. He had held Harlem through 4 months of pressure that should have broken him. He had outmaneuvered a man with more money, more muscle, and more backing. He had earned formal recognition from the most powerful criminal structure on the East Coast. He had won Harlem, and sitting in that car, he understood for the first time that winning a thing and being free of it were not the same condition. That thought sat in the car with him for a long time. He got out, buttoned his jacket against the November cold, and walked toward his table on Lenox Avenue. Harlem moved around him loud and continuous and alive. He walked through the door. 3 weeks after Dutch Schultz died, a runner named Calhoun Williams stopped showing up. Not Roosevelt Williams. Roosevelt was recovering slowly, his broken hands healing crooked in ways the doctors said were permanent, learning to write again with fingers that bent at wrong angles and ached in cold weather. Calhoun was different. Calhoun was 21 years old, lean and quick and smart in the street-level way that got young men jobs in Harlem's numbers corridor. He had also, during Schultz's push, taken money from the wrong people and fed information through a pipeline he didn't fully understand. Bumpy had known about Calhoun for weeks before Schultz died. He had used the leak, mapped it, and pulled every piece of useful intelligence from it before letting it run dry. He had made a decision cold and precise and necessary that removing Calhoun early would close the pipeline too soon and cost him information he needed more than he needed to hold someone accountable. So Calhoun had stayed monitored, useful, unaware of how much Bumpy already knew. Now his room on 126th Street was cleaned out, not ransacked, cleaned. Clothes gone, personal items gone. Nothing left except the smell of the cheap soap he used and a broken coat hook on the back of the door that he apparently hadn't considered worth taking. A deliberate departure by a young man who understood he had run out of time and made the only decision available to him. Bumpy did not send anyone after him. He told Marcus this on a Tuesday morning over coffee that had gone cold while they sat at the table on Lenox Avenue. He ran, Marcus said. He ran, Bumpy said. You're not going to... No, Bumpy said. He did what I would have done. Marcus said nothing, because Marcus understood the difference between holding someone accountable in a way that served the organization and punishment that only served the need to punish. Calhoun had already paid. He would spend the rest of his life in whatever city he had run to, carrying the specific weight of a choice he had made at 21 when someone put more money in front of him than he earned in a month, waking up every morning and checking the street before he stepped outside, never using his real name in a new neighborhood, without wondering who might be listening. That was a sentence just not one recorded anywhere official. Calhoun's mother and two younger sisters pulled their curtains closed earlier after that, shopped at different hours. The mother, 11 years at the same laundry on 124th Street, never missed a shift, always paid her bills on time, handed in her notice without explanation, and found work somewhere across town in a neighborhood where nobody knew her son's name. Bumpy left an envelope at her door the following week. No note, just cash. Enough for 3 months of rent, and then some. She never acknowledged it. He didn't expect her to. Acknowledging it would have required a conversation that neither of them had the words for. There were others. A man on 118th Street who had been standing on the wrong corner in August when two groups with competing instructions arrived simultaneously at a collection point. He had no connection to either organization, just a man who worked at a loading dock and took a different route home that evening because the weather was good and he felt like walking. Schultz's men had hit him with a pipe before realizing their mistake. He lost 2 teeth and the hearing in his left ear. His wife filed a police report that went into a drawer somewhere and stopped moving. Bumpy paid his medical bills through a go-between. Cash to a doctor who asked no questions and filed no paperwork. It covered the teeth. It didn't cover the hearing, which wasn't coming back or the way the man now flinched at sudden sounds and stopped taking different routes home regardless of the weather. Every power struggle gets settled by the men in the room. It gets paid for by everyone outside it. A 16-year-old boy who had watched Roosevelt Williams get beaten from a fire escape on 116th Street had stopped going to school. His teachers noted the absences. His mother attributed it to something typical of teenagers, unnamed. He sat at their apartment window for hours, watching the street below, with the specific alertness of someone who had learned that the city's violence was not something that happened to other people and did not restrict itself to people who had chosen to be involved in it. Bumpy walked the West Side corridor alone on a Thursday afternoon in November, past the barber shop on 128th where the rumor had started, past the hardware store on 116th where Roosevelt had been left on the pavement with his hands broken, past the building on 126th where Calhoun's family had learned to close their curtains before dark. He stopped outside a church on 131st Street and stood on the sidewalk for a while. The building was old enough to have seen everything this block had ever been. The stone smelled like cold, and something older than cold, like accumulated years of people bringing the worst things that had happened to them through those doors and leaving them there because they had nowhere else to put them. A woman came out, looked at him without recognition, nodded once, and walked on. He stood there another minute. Then he straightened his jacket and walked back toward Lenox Avenue. Order had returned to Harlem. He had made that happen, and he would keep it happening. But order was not wholeness. The distance between the two was measured in people whose names appeared in no account of what had occurred here, who would carry the weight of these 4 months in their bodies and their routines and their children's behavior for years after the men who caused it had been forgotten. He sat down at his table. The coffee was hot. Outside, Harlem kept moving. He drank it and thought about what came next. The confirmation came on a Tuesday morning through a phone call that lasted 4 minutes. Vincent's voice, quiet, precise, the voice of a man delivering a decision that had been finalized before the phone was picked up. The commission confirms the arrangement. Harlem operates under your management. Structure is in effect as of this week. Quarterly coordination begins in January. "I'll be there," Bumpy said. The line went dead. He set the receiver down and looked at the wall of his office, a small room above a dry goods store on Lenox Avenue. Nothing on the walls except a calendar and a clock. For a long moment, then he put on his jacket and went downstairs. Marcus was on the sidewalk. He read the answer before Bumpy spoke. "It's confirmed," Marcus said. "It's confirmed." They walked north on Lenox Avenue toward 125th Street. The afternoon was cold and gray and smelled like exhaust and food, and the particular dampness of a New York November that had settled in and intended to stay. Delivery trucks sat double-parked on 125th, their drivers moving boxes with the mechanical efficiency of men who had done this route so many times the work happened without thought. A woman argued with a vendor over the price of something wrapped in paper. 2 men in heavy coats stood outside a barber shop, talking with the relaxed comfort of people who had nowhere urgent to be. The lights on 125th were burning through the afternoon gray the way they always burned. Same poles, same bulbs, same amber light spreading across the same wet pavement. But the light felt different. Bumpy noticed it without being able to fully name it, the specific quality of a street seen through different eyes than the ones that had walked it in June, before Dutch Schultz had announced his intentions and set 4 months of violence and calculation and quiet devastation into motion. He had walked this block 10,000 times. He would walk it 10,000 more. The man walking it now was not the same man. "How does it feel?" Marcus asked. The question was unusual for Marcus, who dealt in practical matters rather than feelings. Bumpy thought about it seriously before answering. "Like winning something that immediately becomes the next obligation," he said. "Is that bad?" "It's accurate," Bumpy said. "Bad doesn't come into it." The commission's recognition changed the practical reality in ways that would become clearer over months. Protection that went beyond what independent operation could provide. Access to political connections operating at levels his own network couldn't reach. Supply lines, legal resources, the structural guarantee that no other organization could move on Harlem without facing consequences from above. It also meant the quarterly coordination, the percentage moving upward on a schedule that didn't flex for difficult months, the requirement to clear anything crossing borough lines, the constant settled presence of an authority above his own that he had not had to answer to before. He had exchanged freedom for security. He had made the exchange knowing exactly what he was doing. And knowing exactly what you're giving up doesn't reduce the weight of the giving. It just means you carry it without the additional burden of surprise. They reached the corner of 125th and Lenox and stopped. The avenue ran in both directions through the heart of a neighborhood that had survived things it shouldn't have survived and held its identity through all of it. Loud and layered and continuous and stubbornly alive. A young runner crossed the street in front of them, 19 years old, maybe 20, moving with the quick, purposeful walk of someone who understood the value of being on time. He glanced at Bumpy without recognition and kept moving, already somewhere else in his head, already thinking about his next corner. Bumpy watched the kid disappear around the corner and thought, that boy trusts the ground beneath his feet without knowing who bled to keep it solid. And that was exactly how it was supposed to work, and exactly what made the weight of it permanent. The street kept moving. The lights kept burning. Bumpy turned and walked back toward Lenox Avenue. The cold was settling harder now, getting into his coat and staying. His table was waiting. His coffee would be hot. He walked through the door, sat down, and looked out at the street through the window. Harlem moved around him, loud, continuous, indifferent to its own history, and entirely defined by it. He was still here. So was Harlem for now. That was the whole story. The old order collapsed because one man's ambition outran his judgment. The new order rose quietly, built from control, cold calculation, and agreements that were never written down and never needed to be. Harlem survived. Bumpy held the line. But every choice made in those 4 months left a mark in the ledgers, in the silences, in the people who carried the cost without ever sitting in the room where the decisions were made. There are no heroes in this story. Only men who understood that power is never free and that the bill always arrives after the feeling of victory has faded. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and stay close, because the next story is already waiting, and it runs just as deep. Thank you for watching until the end. It means everything. Now, tell me in the comments, do you think Bumpy Johnson made the right call by joining the commission structure, or did surviving cost him the very thing he was fighting to protect? And who do you think really won in 1935?